Welcome to another Mike Reads Reviews. Today we're going to be reviewing Star Wars Tales from the Empire, edited by Peter Schweighofer. This is a collection of short stories that was put together at the end of the 90s and the late 90s. I don't know exactly when. It includes works from the likes of Timothy Zahn, Michael Stackpole, Patricia Jackson, and a host of other writers. It does contain at the end the novella. I believe it's called Side Quest. So let me just look through this table of contents here real quick. Side Trip, sorry. Parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I always like to start off with the edition itself. This is an edition that I'm not sure where exactly to get as of the creation of this video and this review. This is something that I just have had on my bookshelf for God knows how long, and decided to reread because the last time I read it I was like 10 and I didn't get much from it. But I'm not sure exactly where we're going to get it. I'll post a link in this video's description to the closest thing I can find to it, if I can find any version of it. And I want to talk about the version itself. I want to talk about a little bit of a background behind this version briefly. But before I get to that, I'm sure you're going to be asking, Mike, this is all of your videos are on like economics and philosophy. Why are you reading all this Star Wars? Well, because if you've read economics and philosophy, eventually you need to just turn your brain off, and this is where I go to is to these old Star Wars books that I've had on the shelf for a while. And why in particular have I picked Star Wars? Because I have the Black Cauldron series sitting right there too that I could read it by Lloyd Alexander at any time. And I mean I have works by John Paul Sartre that are I don't really like them all that much, but they're much shorter reads, and they're much easier to barrel through than, say, Thomas Sowell's 700-page diatribe on basic economics, which I actually liked. But I guess if I'm being honest with myself, it's the most recent Star Wars movies that have come out, which have been just such a disgrace. Like the three prequels, episodes 1, 2, and 3, were bad. They were downright bad and disappointing, but at least aside from being downright bad and disappointing, they didn't slap the Star Wars fans right in their own face. And that's exactly what these last movies have done. They basically said, you are bad people just for being. We don't like you, go F yourself, and these movies stink. So, there was a time when there was such a thing as the expanded universe, and it was in written form. And it was a wonderful time because the only works we had were the original trilogy, where character development, story arcs, and plot actually mattered. Cohesiveness of the plot actually mattered, right? A cohesiveness of the characters and their evolution. The designation of dynamic and static characters. The clear definition of protagonist versus antagonist existed in that trilogy. That's why those trilogies were so beloved and so relatable, because they were nothing more than the human element in space. It was a space opera for all intents and purposes, and A New Hope was not much more than just a combination of a Western and a samurai movie in space. So I guess what I'm trying to do is relive that experience by bringing myself to the expanded universe where we don't have the prequels. We have the Han Solo trilogy rather than a solo story. We have, the Timothy Zahn Grand Admiral Thrawn trilogy rather than this new garbage. We have, instead of Rogue One, we have the Rogue Squadron series where we have Rogue One being Wedge Antilles, who is the leader of Rogue Squadron, who is effectively the founder of the Rogue Squadron, which has its own whole series outside of the original trilogy, and is regularly a part of major works outside of the trilogy. So, folks, this expanded universe, as a rule, is really well written, because when it comes to a book, you don't have explosions in a book. You don't have, laser beams in a book. You don't have lightsabers in a book. You only have the words that are written on here. So character development and story is imperative to a book even basically existing, even getting through the editorial process, at least in the 90s when the overwhelming majority of these books were written. So I guess the reason I'm on this bit of a Star Wars kick is because I want to bring myself back into that experience, bring myself back to the works of Shadows of the Empire, right? And The Courtship of Princess Leia. These were really well-written books, and they allowed for the expansion of the universe beyond the original trilogy in a manner that was respectable. And, you know, it's just not where we are today. So that's why I've been on the Star Wars kick. I know I'm getting a bit long on the setup here, so allow me to continue with the setup before I get into the actual meat of the book and the content of the book. The book, from what I understand, was basically nothing more than a cash grab. I think it's acted to its detriment in terms of the content. Basically, what happened was I guess there was this new promotion for toys or something in relation to the special edition releases of the original trilogy, and they wanted these already successful writers within the expanded universe, for the most part, to put together a group of short stories to effectively promote certain elements of these new toys. So it kind of shows in some of these books, some of these stories. Honestly, the more obscure the writer, and this is where we're going to get into the content, the more obscure the writer in this series, and the shorter the story, the better it was. The best story in here is by some writer that I have no knowledge of, even to this point, and I don't think I can even look her up. And it was like a 14-page story. This is a collection of roughly a dozen short stories, 320, 330-ish pages long. The worst story is the one where it's written by Michael Stackpole and Timothy Zahn, and that is Side Trip. It's honestly the worst thing in here. And I feel like that's because they were basically pressured into this type of a story, and that, generally speaking, when you get two writers to work together on a singular written book, bad idea. It's a bit of a novella in terms of its length. It's not a true novel. It's not really a short story. I mean, it's 120-something pages long. So, actually, I take that back. It's a roughly 100 pages long. So I think that's what the suffering is from this book. The best story in here is probably a solid 8. I mean, they're short stories. You're not from the expanded universe. I mean, you're not going to be really emotionally invested in any of the characters in these short stories because they're short stories. That's what they're there for. You're not really going to be totally emotionally invested in the story itself. Again, they're short stories from the expanded universe, focusing on the Empire. There are really obscure characters that only appear in this work. So, the worst part of this, the worst stories in this hover around that 3 or 4 rating, and the best stories hovering around 7 or 8. You're not going to get a 10 out of a novel like this. The only time that's going to be the case is when you get Tales from the Empire. Tales from the Empire being by far the best of the Tales from series. Mos Eisley Cantina was solid. I think I remember reading Bespin Cloud City. That one was pretty solid. And I don't know if there was a Tales from the Rebellion. I remember there being 5 Tales from that I read. And this is Tales from the Empire. Probably, honestly, the worst. And I think that's because it was the only one that was specifically ordered to promote some toy. It wasn't something where, a bunch of writers got together and said, hey, we've got this cantina that's got all these really cool characters that we could write stories for. Or, hey, what's the background on these bounty hunters? Like, they're supposed to be ominous foes. There's something there. Which is probably why the Tales from the Bounty Hunter is the best one. And honestly, actually, Boba Fett's from memory was the worst one of that series. But we're getting a little off track here. I think if I'm going to give this thing a rating on a scale of 1 to 10, it's going to be really, 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 really hard. I think I'm going to go with a weak 6. I think I'm going to go with a weak 6 because of the fact that it really is just a cash grab. And once you read the history of that, then the crappier version, the lesser stories, if you will, really start to leave a bitter taste in your mouth. Would I recommend this? Honestly, there are there's a brief mention of Mara Jade. There's brief mentions of, for example, who became the character that became General Veers and Darth Vader. Brief mentions of Prince Xizor. Otherwise, I mean, these characters are basically specific to these stories. So if you want something to put down next to the toilet that's related to Star Wars, I guess, and just to immerse yourself into very different characters that have no other appearance outside of that book, then go ahead and check out Tales from the Empire, edited by Peter Schweighofer. Otherwise, I mean, I would think that you'd have to be pretty much a Star Wars specialist to really have any interest. Otherwise, I don't know if I'm going to recommend it. So 6 out of 10. That's I'll post a link into this description to whatever I can find as far as getting your hands on it. So this has been a Mike Reed's review. We'll see you in the next one.